Good morning, everyone, and I'd like to welcome you to this event, which is part of our Changing Face of London series. And first of all, I'd like to thank our champions, Atkins, London Communications Agency, and GL Hearn, as well as our supporters, who are Argent, Berkeley Group, British Land, Canary Wharf, City of London, the Crown Estate, Delancey, Derwent, Peabody, Qatari DR, Quintain, and Stanhope. And they all make this project possible. So the Changing Face of London reprises the very first exhibition we put on in the NLA galleries back in 2005. And it showed the major regeneration sites across the capital that were about to transform the face of London. Now, 15 years on, the exhibition and publication, they look again at those sites, how they've changed and how they will change in the future. Now, the exhibition is currently open in a COVID secure gallery environment, both at the Building Centre, where we have the whole exhibition, and there's another exhibition also in the City Centre, which focuses, of course, on the Square Mile. And those displays will be up until March 2021. So we're keeping up longer than we normally do, obviously because of the current situation. So we can't have as many people in the galleries as we normally would. But as I say, they are safe, and so we are sensitive to the COVID regulations. So today we're going to hear from some of the key people who have helped shape London over those 15 years. And we've asked each of them to give a short response on what they think has been the biggest transformation in London over that period and what this has meant for the capital. We are now going to ask our panelists to talk about what they see as the biggest contribution in London over the last 15 years and what this has meant to the capital. And before we start, I'd like to remind you that there will be a Q&A at the end, so you can post your questions using the button on your screen. So my first speaker, I'm very pleased to welcome, is Bob Allies, partner of Allies and Morrison, who have been involved in many of the key master plans around the capital, from the Olympic Park to King's Cross to Wood Wharf. So Bob, if you would like to start, please. Right. No, where's Bob? Right. Well, we seem to have lost Bob. So let's go to Annie Hampson. Annie Hampson is a former Chief Planning Officer at the City of London. And so I'm going to ask Annie to speak about her experience of these past years leading work in the City of London. Annie.
Thank you. I think one of the things that needs to say, perhaps particularly as a sort of general point, is that since 2005, London has been on a trajectory of growth, and except for the blip in the when we had the financial crisis. And this has meant, in some ways, a number of challenges and opportunities. There's been a huge rise in population, a huge rise in inward migration, and a consequent growth in jobs. And came with that, in fact, some new players on the block, and a significant amount of new foreign investment came into London, which I think actually, again, changed London to quite some degree. I think there was also quite a lot of recognition that although there was huge growth, huge opportunities, that there was also consequences and still continuing inequalities in London. One of the things, again, a very significant issue for London was actually the congestion charge. And though I wouldn't claim to be a transport expert, you know, I think it changed both the amount of traffic that was coming into London, and it also, I think, enabled people to sort of rethink and think changed the priorities such that there was a tremendous increase in cycling. It hasn't unfortunately continued, but there was a tremendous increase in cycling, and also an opportunity that it presented to improve the pedestrian environment. So I think, although, you know, it wasn't, I think it has had a huge change in terms of the approach to London. I think the other thing that is sort of perhaps key to London is the degree to which there has been change right across London. And there have been some very, very significant sort of opportunities and changes. Clearly, others will talk much more about the Olympics in King's Cross, but I think they really have been hugely important contributions to London. I think turning to the city, again, not necessarily talking about physical things to start with, but almost changes in thoughts. And I think over these last 15 years, I think there was much more recognition in the city that it wasn't an island, but that its success entirely related to London. And therefore, the degree to which it was interlinked with a thriving London was absolutely key to its success. I think another thing that emerged was the very big banks had to some degree begun to move away from the city, but also a recognition that the city in fact wasn't occupied by a few very large players, that there were actually a huge number of SMEs. In fact, the city is made up of 98% of small and medium-sized enterprises, which changed again, I think, the recognition of what they needed and what were drivers for city. I think the other thing that I think was actually also key was there was a recognition that the city's sort of heritage, its street patterns, its environment was not a problem as it had been seen in the 90s, but was actually a vital part of its DNA and part of the quality of what the city was all about. And I think that also came sort of hand in hand with a recognition of the importance of the street scene, enhancing sort of not pedestrianisation, but enhancing greater movements sort of through the city with sort of people. And I think, again, sort of the removal of traffic largely from Bank Junction was absolutely sort of key to that. And I think also that, which again, I think is something that has gone up the agenda, is this whole issue about culture and well-being and the need for sort of workers to have other resources other than, you know, just a place of work. And finally, I'm sure you'd expect me to talk about the city cluster. Of course, that has been a huge sort of change in the London skyline. I think, you know, many times we've all discussed as to why it clusters in this area, which was to protect views of London and other constraints within the city. And again, that buildings have absolutely been shaped and formed around sort of viewing corridors, such that the skyline is sort of safeguarded, but also influenced by these shapes. I think it's true to say that the city always insisted on the quality of architecture that related to these buildings that did have a big presence in London. And also that arguably public benefits came from them as well. And again, we have very much encouraged public access and roof gardens to these buildings so that the city is a more accessible and inclusive sort of place than arguably it was before, when arguably if you didn't work in the city, you virtually never went near it. So I think those probably have been, from my perspective, the biggest changes.
Thank you very much, Annie. It's interesting, actually, that I think today the One City Instagram page reached over 50,000 followers, making it the largest single area Instagram page in London, which I think suggests the sort of changing demographic of the city, which people always expect it as rather older people in suits, but actually the demographic of the city is very different to that. So now our next speaker is Roger Madeline, and he now is joint head of Canada Water Development by British Land, but of course before that was looking after the development of King's Cross. So Roger, over to you.
Thank you, Peter. Annie touched on business and the economy a little, and I think those of us who are old enough to have been around London in the 80s will generally say that London is a much better, more livable city than it was in the 80s. But we have to be very careful because some issues are still there, some issues have got worse. But the massive change has been entirely as a result of London successfully maintaining its economy and growth by being a very open and welcoming city, and open to people and open to finance. And without that continued positive change, and however much we adjust and look at the challenges that have been increasing, we will not be able to continue to address London and making it a better place. And I'm not saying that as a kind of Ramona or anything like that, but I think we just need to recognise that however worthy and marvellous our aspirations are, nothing is going to happen unless London remains a phenomenally successful economic powerhouse to the world. And it's not just money, it is people. And good, bright, young, entrepreneurial people go where good, young, bright, entrepreneurial people are. So we need to make sure that our politicians, as best as they can, and we need to support them to do that. Now, obviously, the last 15 years is a little bit short for us oldies, and we could sense a change. In summary, I think it's been a change in attitude more than anything else. And it did start more than 20 years ago in a big way. And there started to be an intelligent debate, and people started saying, why shouldn't we do things? Why should we always be saying, no, that's the way we've done things? And I was reluctant to give some examples because there have been dozens and dozens of examples, and many hundreds of people, and us on this panel are lucky enough to have been a very small group of people amongst many thousands who have been part of this extraordinary change in London. But the Gherkin, some of you might remember that the original plans from Sir Norman was the Millennium Town. I think it was 1,500 feet, and a lot of people were just going, that is mad, London doesn't do that kind of stuff. And it got reduced, and it turned into a marvellous building, the Gherkin. But that was probably the first one in the city. And we did start to say, why not? There's amazing things happening in other cities. And that debate just became intelligent, informed, and I've got to say fun. And I think the public and the private sector suddenly realised that there's a huge amount of overlapping self-interest, and developers spending hundreds of millions of pounds. It was generally recognised they didn't really want to do things very badly, because if they were going to be here for the next one, if you're doing 50 buildings at King's Cross, you didn't really want to do the first one as cheaply and as nasty as possible. And people like Peter Bishop and the political leadership at Camden with Jane Roberts, right across London, a lot of these conversations were starting to become informed and intelligent. Whether it was the Urban Task Force who kind of kicked all of us into this debate, was it the Mayor's London Plan? Was it the pedestrianisation, park pedestrianisation of Trafalgar Square? Was it the Congestion Charge? Was it suddenly Bob Kiley being paid 800,000 a year to sort out transport for London, and everyone saying, well, that's a small price to pay? That kind of attitude was just a massive change. So the one thing I think has really changed in the last 15 years is attitude. And I do sense that positivity, that collective debate has started to reduce for whatever reason. and it's inherent on all of us and our political leaders and partners to try and reinvigorate that and to deal with the huge challenges we've got ahead. Just people, you know, obviously mentioned, you know, London Plan and stuff, and, you know, I think Peter Rees and Annie, you know, the City of London, the attitude there, it becomes good stuff becomes infectious. English heritage, you know, Ken was, you know, the Taliban and stuff like that, but our experience from King's Cross, and, you know, when people started to engage with, you know, the opponents of change, they realised that actually people in English heritage were really excited about change, and, you know, I think people suddenly started to value what we have and how we could work with it and still do new stuff. Obviously, Crown Estate's doing big stuff. There's hundreds and hundreds of examples across London, and probably thousands of buildings. And one of the many joys about moving from King's Cross to Canada Water, you know, I was talking to Peter Freeman yesterday, who obviously still involved very much at King's Cross. You suddenly start to learn about another part of London, and I said to Peter a few years ago, you know, Peter, you really ought to get out more, because I was just surprised how few places he knew, and he put that back on me when we were walking through Holland Park yesterday, and I'd never seen a Japanese garden there and stuff like that. But when you do get out, you realise that there's been amazing stuff happen, you know, right away. As I've got to know Southwark, you know, extraordinary things have been going on for 15 years, you know, like, and one side of you says, like, how dare they? I thought we were doing all the good stuff. And then you suddenly realise that, you know, there's great stuff happening right the way across London. And you, Peter, I'm being very creepy now, you know, the new London architecture, yeah, you have pulled all this stuff together and tried to show people what great stuff's going, and trying to say to people, you know, the people who've been doing great stuff will help you, you know, look at your challenges, and there'll be completely different challenges, but, you know, you can overcome them. And I think that's the biggest change, the collaboration, the attitude. It's going to be tough moving forward, much tougher for all the reasons we know, but let's just encourage the debate, the intelligent debate, and we need to reinvigorate it. I think, Peter, you do sense, you know, hostility of it's bound to come, isn't it, with the challenges around us. That's me.
Thank you very much, Roger. So yes, and I think trust is in development is clearly a key issue we have to address as well. Now I can see that Bob's video is back. All right, so Bob, can we go to you and see if your line is stable now?
Well, I think I'm back. Is that all right?
Very good. Yes, I can hear you fine. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Well, I thought I'd focus on one particular aspect of what's happened in London over the last 15 years, and do so partly from the experience of our practice as a participant, and partly really as an observer, I suppose. Traditionally, cities have coped with rising populations simply by growing outwards, by expanding their perimeter. In contrast, what London's been consciously doing over the last 20 years is growing internally, expanding at its centre, increasing its density, exploiting areas of unused land, and obviously maximising the potential of its pretty extraordinary public transport system. In the past, it seems to me, the way this growth would typically have happened is through the accumulation of a series of discrete projects, a housing estate here, a business park there, a shopping centre, a health centre, a leisure centre, a college, a station. And each different use was neatly pigeonholed, and different activities were kept apart. This was no doubt a consequence of the persistent influence of the zoning of uses that was embedded in the town and country planning process in the middle of the last century. But it was also partly because of the way the development world had historically been structured, with different companies focusing exclusively on one building type, on housing or offices or retail, each concentrating on their own particular area of expertise. And I suppose actually it's also true that it reflects the way in which public sector procurement was organised, with different agencies assuming responsibility for schools or for housing or for health or public transport. And I suppose what I think has been really exciting about London in the last 15 years is that there's been a very widely shared recognition that simply building individual projects in this way is not enough. And that what we have all had to get involved with, I mean, in all of us in terms of local authorities, designers, clients, the GLA, everybody, what we all had to get involved with is the making or remaking of pieces of city, of urban fabric. What's become increasingly important is how the new relates to the old, to the existing, the way new connections are opened up, the way different uses are encouraged to interact and overlap, the way one element of investment generates another, and the way the benefits of that investment then flow out into a wider area. So how has this happened? Well, I think it was certainly implicit in the work of the GLA under Ken Livingstone, particularly through the endeavours of Design for London when Peter Bishop was leading it. And of course, importantly, it's also been pursued, as others already said, by local authorities, by boroughs such as Greenwich and Newham and Southwark and Croydon and many, many more, who have also seen every single project coming towards them, as it were, as an opportunity to achieve much, much more. And I mean, fortunately, Roger didn't say this, but it was also embraced, I think, by the private sector, by a new generation of developers, like Argent then at King's Cross, who have certainly appreciated the social benefits of this way of thinking about development. But as Roger has said in the past, they also recognise the commercial potential. They recognise that there was a huge public appetite for a richer urban diet, for a more complex, more dynamic, more mixed up environment. So if I was telling you just one example, so I mean at King's Cross, when it finishes in about 5 years' time, it will have, I will call them upmarket offices, I mean serious office buildings. It will have offices for Camden, it has everyday workspace, it has private housing, social housing, student housing, shops, restaurants, universities, galleries, a cinema, a theatre, 2 primary schools, a swimming pool and a library. You know, this is a fantastically diverse place, and I think it's a kind of a paradigm really for so many other projects that are now being carried out or have been carried out over that period. And also, of course, somewhere like King's Cross is really, it determinedly ties itself back into the surrounding area on York Way and Copenhagen Street, along the canal, and then of course back into Euston Road. So really I think for people like us, I mean, and for many other architects over this time, what we've actually seen happen is that our projects have become more and more complex, both in terms of their content and in terms of their scale, as well as in as I've described it, the diversity of their urban ambitions. That is to say, the range of social and environmental and economic benefits that they're expected to provide. So it has been, I think, a pretty remarkable period. Of course, in a way, we may be well into the process of implementing things, but we're a long way from being able to judge their success. I think we will be going back and looking at these projects, particularly the residential aspects of these projects, and it'll be very interesting to see how they do. And then lastly, I was just really going to say that now that this growth, which was so sort of concentrated in the heart of London, it has been gradually moving out towards the perimeter over this period as well. And so we, people like us and others no doubt, are having to think now how best to reconcile this, the kind of urbanism I've described, with the very different characters really of these lower density, lower scale parts of the city. And I suspect that's the subject that we'll all be sitting here talking about in 15 years' time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. And now we move on to Joe Negrini. Joe is former Chief Executive, London Borough of Croydon. And of course, Joe was our New Londoner of the Year in 2018, I think it was, wasn't it, Joe?
Yep.
As of course was Roger a few years earlier. We'll be announcing our New Londoner of the Year in a week or so's time when we start announcing the NLA Awards. So we'll keep you up to date with that. So Joe, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Peter, and thanks for the opportunity to be here today. There's been, it's been an incredible time, as Bob said. It's been a really seismic time in London over the last 15 years, and it's been, when you're kind of thinking about transformation, there's been so many changes and so much transformation, from development transformation and place transformation to thinking differently, delivering differently, different priorities in terms of what's being built, and different transformation of different parts of London that's contributed to the kind of the whole picture. I think in terms of development, for me, and if I'm kind of thinking back and kind of pulling out and moving out of the detail of it, I would, looking back at that 15 years from 2005, it was all about mega projects and tall buildings. That's the thing that I take away from that 15 years, where we had huge brownfield site development from, from the Olympic Park right through to, 40, 50, 60 acre sites that were being developed throughout that time, particularly in the beginning of that period. And that really typified the transformation that was taking place in different parts of London, set within the context of a New London plan, and a policy around these opportunity areas as they were being described and still being described. I do think that, for me, I was very, very fortunate to work in East London at Newham at the time from 2010, and to actually see the impact of something like the Olympic Park on East London, and the kind of growing of Stratford as a major hub and a major competitor really for a lot of other parts of London. But seeing how the confidence that developed as a result of the Olympics, I think, that big projects could be done. And I think Jerome Frost said this at some point about, breaking things down into manageable chunks. And that's actually how London was approached. It was being big chunks of big brownfield sites actually being developed at that time. I do think there's also been a huge transformation in ways of doing things over this 15-year period, and particularly in the rise of the role of local authorities in development. If you looked at 2005, the notion that local authorities would be delivering their own housing and their own development, have their own development companies, I don't think there was confidence in the sector at that point to do that type of thing. And I think generally, as London became a lot more confident, and values, particularly in parts of London, rose to an extent where you could take the risk to actually do that type of development, the public sector started having a huge role in the delivery. And if you have a look at now, nearly every single council in London has their own development company. So earlier on, I remember people coming into Newham saying, well, give us your land and, we'll develop it for you. And that was the conversation that was being had with local authorities, which has now moved to, local authorities being much proactive about the type of development it needs in its area, and trying to address particularly things like the housing crisis, which is, the amount of housing units delivered by council development companies at the moment is quite phenomenal. I do think the other transformation, when I'm thinking about what's changed, has been the development emphasis. Right at the beginning of that period, commercial was really driving a lot of the development at that time. And as we've kind of moved through that 15-year period, the emphasis is so, in some areas, I think to the detriment of some places, just focusing on housing and residential development. Permitted development has had a huge 2013 when that was introduced, had a huge impact on the ways, particularly in outer London, the use of commercial space in outer London was a huge issue. I think the figure we lost in Croydon was around 2 million square foot of, commercial space to really poor quality residential development. And I think permitted development is a really dangerous policy in terms of how that's going to impact, and as Bob said, the urban fabric. And I do think that, in outer London, particularly like Croydon, Ilford, all of those kind of places that had, good quality, in some cases, 1960s commercial development has been replaced by very poor quality housing in those areas, which has had a huge impact on the look and feel, on how people view places, the perception of different places as a result of this poor quality development has had a huge impact. At the beginning of that 2005, around 2005, but predating all of that, into the previous century, there was a huge emphasis on home ownership. That's completely changed now over this period. If you look at Wembley, large developments across London, applications coming into local authorities, it's all built to rent. And I do think there's going to be an interesting discussion that needs to be had about the future of build to rent, the quality of amenity space, the size of units, all of those type of things are going to be very topical, I think, as we move forward into this next part of the transformation of London. I do think that, over this period as well, the rise of out of London, I would say that, wouldn't I? That I do think that, as values have steadily increased across London and in parts of outer London, there has been the rise of as being described, Peter, the polycentric city. But I think what's been lacking on that front is a clear economic strategy for the city in terms of what is the economic role of outer London. It shouldn't just be, it should happen because that's the right thing to do. There needs to be a framework for how London in its totality is looked at, and the role that outer London can play in terms of driving economy. And I think with in a post-COVID environment, I think that discussion is going to be really topical. So just quickly, in terms of the future, I do think that the future transformation is going to be focusing a hell of a lot on local. People are going to fight for their local areas. If these lockdowns continue into the future, people are more protective of their local areas, their local space, than they've ever been before. The rise of social media, keyboard warriors, all of the engagement of people in development is going to be much more critical, I think, as we move forward. I think we'll need to work with a different range of partners. Nobody ever talks about the NHS. I think the NHS has a huge role to play in regeneration moving forward in different places, particularly in terms of putting health and wellbeing at the heart of regeneration in localities, town centres. And I do think the intensification, densification piece, as we move and as things are creeping out into outer London, I've said this before, I think the real battleground in the future is going to be the suburbs, in terms of working out how we, in the most empathetic way, actually approach the intensification of outer London as we're trying to increase housing. So that's it from me. Thank you. I think I've gone a bit over. Sorry, Peter.
That's okay, Joe. Thank you very much indeed. And now we move on to Allison Nimmo, who is former Chief Executive Officer at the Crown Estate. And Allison, of course, was involved in delivery of the Olympics as well. So, Allison, over to you.
Thanks, Peter, and morning, everyone. I would just say it's a great exhibition that Peter and the team have put on, and I would really recommend that people do go and have a look at it if you can do that safely. And when you go into the exhibition, the thing that's the whole centerpiece is the Piper's model, and you're just struck by what everyone's talked about, but seeing just the sheer scale of change and volume all in one place on this model is just like really sort of wow. And it's not just the floor space, but the volume. And, you know, we've changed the skyline of the city, not just the city, but the whole of the city for forever. And as Annie said, the sort of scale of the sort of the numbers of players and the weight of global money that's come into London during that time is quite staggering. Obviously, not just in the new developments, but in the existing buildings. And, you know, that transformational impact that all the speakers have talked about isn't just at the sort of city level, but sort of it really impacts on all of us personally when you look at your neighbourhood. So I'm sitting here this morning under the shadow of the Shard, and, you know, that complete transformation of projects like London Bridge Station, which really have had a huge impact. I think the other fascinating thing about the exhibition and the report is the timeline. And it reads a bit like the best of times and the worst of times. You know, it charts some of the tragedies we've been through as a city and come through them, as well as some of the joys we've navigated. And hopefully that points to the future of how resilient we are as a city. And when you think about some of that huge change that's on that timeline, not just sort of political and social, but some of the technological change which is accelerating now, I was sort of quite staggered thinking, you know, Apple launched the first iPhone in 2007 and we're all addicted to them now. And we wouldn't be on this call now if Zoom hadn't been founded only in 2011. So that sort of accelerated pace of change. And as Peter said, I've been very lucky to be involved in helping to shape not just the East End through the Olympics, but the West End during my 8 years at the Crown Estate. And of course, we delivered the largest development pipeline in the whole of our history. But you look at the model and it's just a tiny pinprick compared to everything else. But of course that, yeah, the model is only the physical thing, and it doesn't show all of the things that are happening in terms of a lot of the great estates, new and old, in terms of that sort of stewardship and curating areas and reinventing areas so that we get a really good mix of uses. And I think the most successful projects, whether they're remaking or new, have really prioritized people and placemaking and great public realm and that mix of use and proper infrastructure. And some of those developments we see have been more successful than others, and it's really important that we learn those lessons for the future. But of course, I just wanted to spend a minute on the project that I feel, and I'm biased, has had the most impact over the last 15 years, and that's London 2012. And a number of people have touched on that, because I think most of London was involved in the delivery in some shape or form. The launch of the NLA 15 years ago obviously coincided with us winning the games, as you said, Peter, back in 2005. And it's one of those moments in life and in a city that everybody remembers where they were. And I was out in Singapore with the bid team, and I can't believe it was 15 years ago. It feels like yesterday, really. And of course, the race was then on to deliver this huge and hugely complicated project with the ultimate of deadlines, which was the opening ceremony, which of course couldn't be moved. And there were many critics back then who said it couldn't be done, and there were a few that said it shouldn't be done. But I do think London 2012 is this great story of when we come together as a city and we come together as a country, what we are capable of doing. And, just with the world watching, we delivered big time. We delivered the best games ever. We all remember the magic of Super Saturday, new sporting heroes and heroines, Danny Boyle's ceremonies, the Games Maker. I mean, it was a magic time. Everybody joined in, everybody was part of it. And I think when we're looking at a city and the shape of the city and the development, some of those sort of magic moments, it's as much heart and soul as it is the physicality. And as Roger sort of said, it was a time of real sort of confidence and can do. And I wish we just captured that in a bottle and could uncork it at the moment, because that's going to be so important as we go forward. But of course, London 2012 wasn't just about the games. It was about a lasting legacy and working with Bob and others, delivering not just the sort of new piece of city in East London, but the perception of East London and the overall shape of London. And that's what Ken Livingstone wanted to happen when he, you know, very bravely sort of said, we're going to have the Olympics and we're going to have it in East London. And I think the whole master plan approach has stood the test of time, you know, creating this framework, not just for the games, but this fantastic new piece of city, which of course is still evolving and being built. And I love going back there. I think it's a great, you know, like King's Cross, there are places that are magical and you go back again and again and use and visit. And I love many of the buildings, particularly the velodrome. But I have to say, especially this summer, the real star of the show is the park. It's an extraordinary piece of city planning, the first royal park in London for a generation. And I guess the question I'd have is, where's the next one going to be? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Alison. And now we move to Colin Wilson, who's now head of regeneration at Old Kent Road in Southwark, but for quite a lot of the 15 years was in the planning department at the at City Hall. So Colin, tell us about your thoughts of the last 15 years. You're still muted, Colin.
Sorry. Right, is that okay? Just picking up on some other points people have made. One of the things I used to do at GLA was obviously travel around London, and we'd be meeting various developers and leaders of councils and chief officers, etc. And they would tell us that their scheme was the most important and the biggest in London. And of course, you would nod your head vigorously. So of course it is. And then you'd go on to the next one the following day. But that was great news because there was lots going on all at the same time. And it was really remarkable stuff. And I suppose it wasn't that a particular project was the biggest project in London, but they were all projects in London. And people just thought of it all as London, and an amazing amount of stuff going on at the same city at the same time. I think one of the other, and the London plan's been touched on, I think one of the other things which has really changed from 2005 was I think planners, people like me, became more assertive about doing planning, and which is very much in the news at the moment with the white paper. Certainly, the London Plan mentioned opportunity areas and said they were areas that should be developed. And as Bob's word, should the city should grow within itself, because the green belt was a commitment. But as to how to do that, in 2005, to be honest, I wasn't very sure. To be honest, I wasn't even sure planners are allowed to do that kind of thing. Would we be told off if we did a bit of master planning? Perhaps we would be. Perhaps I'd be asked to leave the Royal Town Planning Institute. Sorry, it's my phone going off. Give me a moment. And part of that was particularly the opportunity areas where there wasn't a single state ownership. So unlike the Olympics, unlike King's Cross, and in particular, my own experience at Vauxhall Nine Elms, and Bob was involved in that, and also White City, and also Croydon, working with Joe and team around an opportunity area framework there. And I think if you kind of think back to 2005, the Cross River Partnership, a kind of predecessor of the GLA when there wasn't a strategic authority for London, had come up with the Nine Elms Village concept, which was basically to build 800 homes in Nine Elms and sort of tidy up the market slightly. And what it didn't do was say, well, what is the purpose of this place within London? What's its purpose within the London economy and within London society? And within London's heritage, it didn't do those things. It was just looking at an area. It was very, particular to a place, not thinking of it in its wider setting. So what we set out to do there was say within these opportunity areas what their place in London was. What were they there for? A point that I think Joe picked up, and we set out, within working with the local authorities and with developers. So to Roger's point, it was a genuine partnership. So it was a strategic authority, not imposing, but working with local authorities, local people, and developers. And in fact, developers funded that work, and they funded it because, you know, the offer to them was, what if we could come up with a coherent public sector plan for this area within a year? And they said, well, if you could do that, we would pay you to do it. And we said, well, you know, you won't have any final editorial control over that. And they said, no, that's fine, just as long as we know what it is the public sector would like us to do here, how we could deliver the things that Bob was talking about. And I think that was a change in attitude. So to Roger's point about attitude, it was a very different attitude for a public sector planner like me and colleagues to take. And I think what we set up there was a framework which set out that bigger structure. It wasn't, it wasn't an absolute design code. It allowed flexibility. It was a framework because these things evolve. As Alison said, the Olympic Park continues to evolve, Nine Elms continues to evolve, so did White City. And it allowed other people to put in, other ideas, but within a discipline, so it wasn't a straitjacket. And I think what's been astonishing has been speed of delivery. So we got the funding to produce that plan in 2008. And in 2009, we had produced a draft, and that was in November 2009. And in November 2019, last year, I met up with the project team and colleagues from TfL and some of the developers in the pub at Riverlight for a drink. And outside is the old trawler in the dock that we identified in the plan as being kept, and the park that stretches back to the linear park is there as well. And that's all been achieved in 10 years. And that I think is a quite remarkable thing for the public sector to take on the responsibility of that, which surely must be the responsibility of the public sector in those circumstances, and really I think must be one of the key roles for GLA as a strategic authority, to have that conversation with local authorities and to be working with them to deliver that kind of vision. So to make explicit what Bob was talking about growing up within the city, and the parameters that were established there are still being implemented. So the reason Riverlight isn't more than 60 metres high is so you don't see it behind the Palace of Westminster. The reason the tall buildings all sit to one side of Millbank Tower is where that cluster was identified as being, because it's closer to the tube. One of the nice things is it was to go down there and have a look around the Battersea Power Station tube. And I think one of the other important things about that and White City is also that it's been delivered by the finance that Roger's talking about. So it hasn't been subsidised through the taxpayer. It has been delivered largely by the private sector, but with great public benefits. And certainly in some of those park spaces, that linear park in Nine Elms is coming together, and I hope sometime soon you will be able to walk. You can walk down parts of it at the moment, and again, it's a kind of evolving piece. And there's another one in White City, which is the back of the scheme. And I was down at Bob's scheme, the entrance into John Lewis, a couple of weeks ago. And again, within that plan, there was an idea of connecting east to west and north to south, and it was a simple drawing. And Bob's master plan part delivers that. So it shows. I think it shows that kind of thing can be done. In terms of the future, to my mind, COVID is probably one of the greatest challenges to planning the city of London, because it's always been predicated on basically a Victorian pattern of commuting into London. So the Nine Elms Northern Line extension, the Bakerloo Line extension, all those heavy transport interventions. What's their role in a future where, to Joe's point, things are more concentrated possibly on the local and suburban? I was having a conversation just before we started this about are people falling out of the habit of commuting into an office? I quite like meeting up with people from time to time and going into the office. I think everyone does, but I don't think people are going to be keen to do that 5 days a week anymore. And I think the final point from me would be, I think the striking thing for me, and I moved to London in 1990, is that excellence, I think, has become kind of normal. I mean, in the 90s, my early career in planning, it was really dull, and London looked, I thought, really shabby. But you know, over the last 15 years, I think the change has been phenomenal, to the point where it's almost taken for granted.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you, Colin. Very optimistic you two and your comments on. But we're now going to go into little discussion. We've only got sort of 8 minutes to do that, so I'll move straight on to the Q&A which we have here, which I'll just bring together a couple of the questions. Rob Heisman is asking if you could have one wish for the most positive change London could experience in the next 15 years. What would it be? So that's one wish, but also that is, if one connects that to Paul Middleton, who asked about what difference does COVID make going forward, and we've touched a little bit on that. And then when we get to Joe, Paul Middleton had asked, can you define outer London? So I think let's go round the table, and for the sort of one key thing which you the most positive change that London could experience in the next 15 years, what would it be? So I know these things always take a little bit of thinking about, so I'm afraid, Bob, you're going to be you're first on my list. So one really positive thing you'd like to see happen over the next 15 years. You're still muted, Bob.
I don't know what needs to happen for this to be possible, but I do think the arrival of things like the electric scooter changed the way one thinks about mobility, even beyond that of the bicycle, which I know you've been supporting for many years. So I sort of feel that I feel that we're on the edge of a kind of needing to rethink movement within the city and the way roads work within the city. And I suspect that could be a thing which changes things enormously. I mean, so it's not what I want, because I don't know how it's done actually, but I'm interested in the potential of it to change the city again.
Yeah. And next on my list is Annie.
I think, again, one of the things that we've spoken about is, in some ways, I think COVID accelerates things that were already happening. So I think the sort of daily commute is something that definitely won't occur. So how does one sort of replicate arguably certain things? And I think the need to meet, the need to sort of exchange ideas, etc., is still, I think, very much a focus of why, in a way, human beings have always focused on cities. And so I think arguably the thing is, what is going to replace what we've got already? So I think it'll be more sort of mixed spaces, more flexible spaces, and also a greater focus on culture, probably is something I would very much like to see, as well as the public realm.
Thanks, Annie. And Roger.
A reinvigorated continuation of informed, intelligent dialogue, and I know New Labour is persona non grata, but you remember their joined up thinking, and I know it just got criticised because there wasn't a lot, but joined up thinking, the toe bone's connected to the foot bone. Everything we do has wider consequences. And the people that are going to set that framework are our godforsaken politicians, political leaders. Most of the ones I've had the privilege of getting to know over the decades are really nice people in it for a nice job. And I think we should all encourage and support good political leaders, because you wouldn't bloody do it, and nor would I, because it's the amount of crap they get. But they're good guys and ladies, and let's help them, because I think together, sounds like a bloody political rally, doesn't it? But everything's together, everything's connected. So go away, singing the toe bone's connected to the foot bone.
Thank you, Roger. And Joe, what your take off? And if you could just define outer London as well quickly for Paul Middleton, that would be helpful.
Okay, I define it as all those boroughs that are outside of the central activity zone, I guess. That's how I define it.
Good. Okay. And your best thing you'd like to, most positive thing you'd like to see happen?
I'd really like a really clear vision about what London is going to be in the future, to create a really good, blueprint and framework for how the city will develop in the future. That's one thing. And just another quick one. We keep talking about placemaking. I do think, what COVID demands now is a completely integrated approach to placemaking in local areas, and centred around district centres and existing communities, rather than just focusing these developments on new communities moving in. So I do think there is a real opportunity, I think, to redress the balance of attention from these big mega sites to actually really thinking about existing places and how we actually put people's health and well-being and sustainability at the heart of it.
Great, thank you very much. And Alison?
Well, we obviously at the moment we're in the middle of a COVID crisis, but we're also in the middle of a climate crisis, and so my wish would be for clean air, but clean air which we did have in lockdown, and it was lovely to breathe the air rather than eat it in London. But as part of London actually leading the world in the race to zero carbon, I think that's really important in all of this, that we don't miss that bigger picture, and that would be my one wish.
Great, thank you very much. And Colin, how about you?
Yeah, I'll be with Joe. I think it'd be great to have a spatial London plan that set out how all these things and where all these things are going to happen in London, and how they relate to each other, just that is accessible to Londoners and planners and architects and developers. I think Joe's absolutely right. I think without that, and in some ways you think COVID is probably a good time, to do that kind of thing, to reassess and to set out a different way of doing things.
Yeah. Very good. I thought you were going to say, give me the Bakerloo line extension, Colin, but because that's looking a little bit dodgy at the moment, isn't it, in terms of funding? So anyway, let's hope it'll happen at some stage.
We've got a B&Q down the Old Kent Road, Peter, so we are distributing shovels as people are passing through the doors. Very
good. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Get the people behind you, Colin. That's the way forward. So thank you all very much, really, for talking about the last 15 years of London. I mean, there has been major change, and we've had our comments about the future. And I'd just point you, the audience, to our research project or the publication, which is related to Changing Face, which has a lot of additional information that the exhibition doesn't. And one of the key elements of the outcomes of that is that we've delivered a sort of 15-point 2035 checklist. So do look on the website for that, or go to the exhibition, and it's you can see it there, which talks about what we think ought to happen in the London of the future. So thank you all very much for coming, and thank you very much to our speakers. And I would just remind you that this afternoon, actually, we're having a borough briefing with Camden at 4 o'clock. So if you're interested in what's happening in Camden, what Camden is doing over the next 15 years, do come in and join us on Zoom for that. But anyway, thank you very much to our presenters today, and look forward to seeing you all at the NLA sometime in the future in person. Thank you.